No, so I want you to write the phones down if you write those down. Those that you outsource to the technology vendor, you try to technology vendor, which is business. It doesn't need to be specific. Right, so you divide the test into where you fall into cases. Okay?
Because it's only within the EU and then within the EU you have regulated space.
Okay. Let's do 1 more minute. 5 minutes? So much. Okay, 5 minutes. Don't forget at the end to upload it in your form as well. And remember, from now on we're starting to work on your cases, so you can go back through the forms and look at the work you've already done, so you don't have to redo that later. Right? It's a test on the Remember, you can also upload pictures if you want to use paper. That's fine. How's it going? Very enthusiastic. What are the decisions you've already made? Take those steps and choose which ones you want for yourself and your family, and which ones you would have the operating company do, or ESC company do, but if you say we're going to everything in-house, that's fine, as long as you can argue with them.
Yes, we're taking this feedback a bit more actively so that we do it.
But also really expensive. Maybe it's cheaper to outsource production. Because which cases are there? Ooh, that's a problem. I think everyone wants to rep. Which cases did you miss? Red? What the curries? Not too good. Got a lot of data. It's an exciting trip. You guys think oh, it works in China. Nice. That's interesting. I'm looking forward to reading this report. So they have 9 different choices. They have to do 2. So they didn't want to read the same report. Okay. We have 1 minute left to finalize your findings for now. You can always come back to that. Yes, and upload it to the forums as well. Could you also please add which 2 cases you are doing? Which cases do you guys think? Energy drink. Energy drink is a really popular one. I should made up another one. Sorry? Kombucha. That's a big drink. Yeah, sure.
And bread.
If you change one of the amounts from one of the cases to Spain and that's fine. Yeah, 10 seconds left. Time to start uploading. Hey, 7. So let's see. Did you guys put it in management? Come on guys, start uploading. We have a lot more opportunities to work today, so. So we have energy drink and bread. Operating companies, because we own it. Who was that? Which group is this? You guys? You're badass. I like it. Let's see what we have. Soap company in right. right?
Yeah.
And where's the second, what's your second case?
The two-pet, we haven't done it.
No, that's fine, but I just want to know what the second
Yeah,
case
the
is.
two-pet. And also I was thinking about like the first one, like the 10 kilometers of the production thing, like outside of the country, outside of the city.
Okay. Interesting. So we have a large variety of different cases. Paper production plant in Finland, that was a popular one. How many people chose Finland? How many people chose energy drink? Oh, so we have two of the same reports. It means I can compare them and see which one is better. Okay, so I'm gonna reply to all of these later tomorrow, so there may be some more feedback. But I'm really glad to see that everyone has already chosen cases. That means that we can start working on them instead of move everything to the end of the block. We still have quite a bit of work. So, what would you outsource and insource? That's what we just did. We're going to briefly look at how projects are usually done in the past and how they're done now, and then you can relate that to what you just designed. So, old school, everything used to be done in-house. So companies used to be massive, they used to be very efficient, and they used to do almost everything in-house, outside of consulting, and usually contractors used to be another massive company. Now, generally before 1970, if you're in Japan, or 1980 if you're anywhere else. Why? Because Japan used to be the forerunner in terms of production technology. They had the most efficient production system in the world. Nowadays, it's not that good anymore. Germany is the best, followed by the Netherlands, and then probably Japan. The reason why is because Japan hasn't grown in about 30 years, so they've not had any economic growth in 30 years. And the Netherlands is the highest trade surplus in the world, with about 100 billion euros, followed by Germany, followed by China. So yeah, we're quite good at producing. China is getting a lot better at producing every year. In a few years, they'll be the best, without question, easily. India is also coming up. Not as fast as China. China is better, at least in production, not in general. I mean, you cannot say a country is better or worse than China. Brazil is coming up quite fast. Russia is coming back. America is lost. Although Trump's policies are actually making it better, at least in terms of production. The UK has no production left. Everything is gone. But what you see is once a country stops producing, they also lose their consultants. Because if you don't have companies that produce, you cannot sell knowledge, and you cannot gain knowledge. So in the beginning, a lot of British consultants, they used to sell knowledge outside of the UK. But now even with Brexit and all of that, you're starting to see a decline there as well. So after Brexit, the UK is just going to survive in banking. And well, that's a very dangerous proposition for a country. And then there's other countries there where some people think they produce a lot, like France, Italy, Spain to some degree. But they do produce a lot, but it's usually very low value goods. They don't really produce anything high tech, at least not comparable in the same quantities as Germany. So that's a bit of an issue. Austria produces a lot, watches. If you ever want a nice watch, go to Austria. Spend like 20,000 euros. So this is how it used to be done in the past, right? So almost everything is done by people in the company. Very inefficient, takes forever, not good. So now, what you're seeing is that most, or if not all the tasks are being outsourced. So if you remember that everything that was black was done in-house, almost nothing is done in-house now. So, right, you need to look at it like red is the operating company, so that can be an in-house operating company, because like we said, we own it. So what you see is that the business input is from the operating company. Project manager, even the project managers are not always from the companies anymore. It's quite efficient to hire a project manager from outside, because they do not have the same biases that someone who already works in the firm does. But everything else basically is outsourced. And, like we discussed earlier, the consultants are the ones who are earning the most. So go become a consultant, basically. right? You'll hate your job, but you'll earn so much money. It's amazing. Even if you're doing a master's, you can be a consultant at the same time. You can easily get like 300 or 400 euros a day. It's quite nice. So after the class, I want you to just relook at what you just did and see how how much is similar to what you did, where the differences are, and try to think why the differences are there. Of course, if they're the same, then good job. And there's not, like we said earlier, it's not necessarily wrong if you do something different than this, right? So if you have a really good reason to do it differently, that's fine. Just make sure that you have your reasons and that you communicate them properly in the report. So we base our costs on this, on these task divisions, because we think it's more efficient to do it because of this. And maybe like a few references in there and you're done. But if you just tell me we're doing it like this, and it costs so much, then you're not getting high grade. So argumentation, rational, reference. That's what we need, right? Good. Right, so you can see the three different companies or the three different types of companies, they sort of overlap here. Where you have green, red, green, blue, red, or even red, green, and red, blue. So you can see that sometimes it's more than one type of company working on the same type of task. Or it could be one company that does different types of things. So you can have a consultant firm or an engineering and construction firm who also has technology patents. So if we go back to Marike's biotechnology lab, it could very possibly be a consultant who says, hey, that's very interesting, buys the patent from them, and then licenses the patent to another company. So there's companies that focus specifically on that, especially in pharmaceuticals. They'll get researchers at universities to come up with like a very first stage drug. They then buy the patent and license the patent to Pfizer or one of the big pharmaceutical companies for huge profits. And all they really do is just look around for exciting research. So there's different types of layers of consultings, different types of layers of patent vendors and all of that type of things. And it also depends on the country. So if you're working in Finland, which some of you are going to be doing, it's a very highly regulated market with very strict laws in terms of what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Someone chose India, which has almost no regulations, and you can do basically whatever you want, right? So you may even be able to dump chemical waste legally. But if you decide to do that, I would like to see a small part on ethics. So do you think even more tasks are going to be outsourced in the future? Is there anyone who thinks even more tasks are going to be outsourced? Why?
Because it's a trend.
So,
It's a trend to be a player.
right.
So
Self-employed.
yeah, self-employed. And I think there will be more people who will do it.
Right. Maybe. So anyone who thinks she's wrong? Oh, it's fine to argue against each other. Does everyone agree with her? Really?
I only think that like some things are sensitive. So I mean, sensitive information will not get outsourced.
Why not?
Because I think every company, even if you compare companies in the same sector, they have their own recipes.
Right, secrets, yeah.
Right, secrets. So that will not be shared with an outsourced company. So all the things that are done within a company in a very certain way will not be given to another company to do it for them because
But what
they
if
want to keep it to themselves.
what if they make them sign a non-disclosure agreement? Because you've already signed NDAs, I think, for some projects that you work on. So if you do that as an outsourcing company, and you then sell the secret, you're fucked. You're gonna be sued. So,
But I think it still happens.
right.
Secrets are leaked,
So the point that you're stressing is that trust is very important, essentially. And I think she's right. I think that there are certain things that you're not going to trust someone else to do. That's probably why Coca-Cola only has a few people who actually know the entire recipe, right? Because that's the value. So a lot of these tasks, they can be outsourced, they can be NDA, a lot of the information that's considered sensitive is actually not sensitive. It's just like we do it this way, but it doesn't really matter if our competitors don't. But there are some core concepts that are very important. It also depends on the industry. So if you're in the food industry, a recipe, you cannot patent a recipe. So that's really difficult. If you're selling pharmaceuticals, you can patent it, which means that you openly disclose the way the chemical structure and the way it's produced. So everyone can see, including consumers, but no one else can use it. So it depends on the industry and the level of trust. But it's very important that if you work, for instance, on paper production, there's not going to be a lot of secrets in producing paper, right? Because paper is paper. But if you're going to be producing energy drinks, which have 1 million or 1 billion different recipes, you're going to need to come up with some type of recipe that you can sell, but also protect. So again, it depends on the industry, it depends on the company. That's fine. Consequences. So in a project, several companies work together. That can be 2 companies, it can be 200 companies. If you go to a country like Japan, you have something called a kairetsu, which is basically a lot of different companies working together as a family, right? So that usually that means that the companies will all own a small part of the other company, and they sort of work together as a group. In Europe and the US, that's illegal. In Japan, it's the standard. So in Europe, you're not allowed to work with your competitors, right? So if you Nestle could not partner up with Unilever for a new product, because then there's not enough, you create a monopoly, there's not enough competition. The Japanese culture says a monopoly is fine, because eventually they trust the people in the business enough to keep the prices down. Well, European or American or most other countries really, or region, would say, I don't trust the business person, I want competition to keep the prices down. So the amount of teamwork or networking that you have in your companies matters a great deal, because the more companies involved in your network, the harder it becomes to work together. You've seen it in a small scale with your projects. If you're working with 3 people, it's very easy to communicate. If you're working with 6, it's harder. If we would do a project with all of PFT together, it would be a nightmare, right? Imagine that, 500 PFT students, 18 staff, all coming together, working on one project. How much chaos that would be. Imagine now that we also add the Hogeschool Leiden chemical laboratory and the Hogeschool Rotterdam, their chemical engineers, maybe the TU Delft chemical engineers, and all of those together would have to work on one project. Then I actually think the students would do quite well. It would be the staff who would be like, no, I want to be in charge. But the essence is that the bigger the network becomes, the harder it becomes to communicate, the harder it becomes to work together. But at the same time, you also create more value. Because the bigger your network is, the more experts you have, the more knowledge you can share, and the easier it is to trade. So it's always a trade-off between going bigger and trust. So trust, from a management perspective, is very, very important. So if you're working on your projects, you may have to say, when you're designing your supply chain, which we learned in logistics, I may need to see some companies that you're going to be partnering with. Because otherwise you will not be able to, and that does not need to be like a formal partnership to produce the same product. It can be, I'm going to buy their product. But that still is a partnership. So you need to take into account where you're going to get your products from and whether or not that makes sense as well, right? So I want to challenge you to think about all the things around a production factory and not so much about the production process itself. So the operating company can be a joint venture, so it means that 2 different companies are own part of the company. Usually they're 2 big companies. Sometimes it's a small company together with a big company. China is a really good example of this. If you are a non-Chinese company and you want to start a division in China, it needs to be owned for at least 30% by a Chinese person. It's very smart. It's also not legal in Europe, but so for instance, Amazon, if they want to go to China, they would have to create a partnership with Alibaba, which is their direct competitor. So it creates an environment where your market is protected quite well. And China can do that because there's, a huge internal market. But a country like them descendants would not be able to do that, because if we did that, Amazon would just say, fuck you, I'm moving to Germany and earn much more money. But China is such a big market that they can do that. America could do it as well. Europe as a union could do it, but we don't. Realistically. We don't work well together in Europe. So the companies can be based in different regions in the world. They do not have to be closely packed to each other, although it is more efficient to be close to each other. Teamwork, technology transfer. So technology transfer, that's when technology goes from one company to a different company. So something like if you're working in a paper factory, you may have some sort of new stripping machine, right? So a machine that strips the wood off the external layer before it can be shredded. Maybe one company in your partnership has a machine that's better, and you can get that same machine in your own company. That's called technology transfer, right? So when technology goes from company A to B, free or paid, doesn't matter, that is technology transfer. It's a very important concept. But effective communications and teamwork across different sectors, across different companies, cultures is really difficult. Again, so that's why you will usually see networks of companies around the same area. For instance, the BioLegis Science Park, where you have a lot of biology-related companies together. They all speak English, so they can all work together. It would be much harder to do that if all of the companies were in different countries. So you usually, so Silicon Valley is another good example, right? So you have all the IT, all the biotech is all in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, or in Boston. But they're all in the same very close packed region, because they can literally walk to each other and say, well, we can go to him or her and get this and this and this, and we can do this and this and this, because that adds value to the entire group as a whole. That's basically the same reason why if you ever see a car company, you know, one of those places where they sell cars, there tend to be a lot of them together, because they know that if they group together, they can get more people to the area, even if not everyone buys a car from that specific store. It's the same principle, just bigger. So good project management becomes more important the bigger the network of companies becomes, right? So the bigger the network, the better your project management needs to be. That's where you will be for. You may be hired to manage a $10 billion project that spans 6 or 7 countries and 2 continents. Then you better be a very good project manager, right? Because there's going to be a lot of stakeholders that are going to come to you and say, well, I need this and this and this and I need it now. You're like, well, but that's in Brazil. I'm in Zambia. How are we going to do that? That's your problem. So becoming a PMP, as that very enthusiastic American lady said, can be a very difficult job, especially in companies or networks that are transcontinental. So if, again, Amazon is a good example, huge company, very hard to do anything because it's so big. Project planning. So project needs to meet 3 different criteria, right? So it needs to be on time, on cost, and on wishes. So on wishes sounds a bit weird, but basically you have all experienced that with teachers. You have all experienced when teachers asked something but actually wanted something else, right? So anyone who's not experienced that in a project where you thought they asked for something completely differently than what they grade you on. It's fine to just, okay, everyone who has had that, just raise your hand, I just want to see. Where a teacher has asked you to do a project, and then later turned out that they meant something completely different. So see how difficult communication is when you are talking about projects? No, go ahead.
I'll send you a picture. Swing. You know that one?
Oh,
Okay. So that's why as a consultant or as an engineer, you always need to find the wishes of the person you're working for. And that's not always the same as what they think they want or what they say they want. A very good example is any projects that you would have to do with Ben. I love him, he's a really nice guy, but he tends to want very different things than what he's actually asking for. So it becomes a very important skill to listen to what he's saying and then to ask questions. There's only one question that you need for any person to get to the wish. Why? So what? Why, comma, so what? Question mark. Write it down. Doesn't matter what project it is. You can ask it 20 times until you get to the actual wish. So I want to, an example would be, I want a paper factory in Finland. Why? So what? Why? Because I want to know if it's a good investment. So I can invest my money. Why? So what? Because I want to earn money. Ah, very different. I don't actually care that it's a paper factory in Finland. I just want to find a good place to put my money. See how going from I want a paper factory to I actually just want to earn money gives you a very different task, because now you don't need to get the most detailed paper factory. You just need to know if it's going to make me money. And that's the same for any type of project. Usually what people want is different than what they'll say. So write it down one more, why, comma, so what. You can ask it 6, 7, 8 times until you feel that you actually get the wish. At the end you can show what you're actually asking for is how can we earn you the most money, or how can we do this and this and this for you. Right? So that will help you a lot.
I'll send you a picture.
Oh. Let's see what she said. Exciting. And wants to place a bet. It's taking forever.
I kind of heard it.
Right.
Here you can make a deal. Especially like how the project was documented.
Yeah, so this is a really nice way to visualize a project. I think all of you will probably have experience with at least one of these. But that's basically the same thing. I think this is the most important one. Always give this and sell for this. This is the consultant who did this. That's why all the money went. Anyway. So basically, if you remember this slide, this is basically how a design and construction process goes. Although we discussed some changes that we would do, they're in the lecture 1 slide, so you can go back to those. Essentially, to this blocker, obviously, all of it takes time. Makes sense? We're focusing on this part, right? Everyone remembers that, right? We're focusing on this part. So later today, in about 5 minutes, we're going to be doing that for the 2 cases as well. So usually projects are developed and implemented by the project manager together with teams. It's not nice if one person says we're going to do this and this and this. You set deadline for the completion of activities and intermediate deliverables. Again, in the Gantt chart or any other type of visual, you would probably say it has to be done like this. You need to make it smart. You allow scheduling of supporting independent tasks, so the project manager is not going to do everything by themselves or herself. Allow estimation of required manpower. So for every stage, you need to know how many hours you're going to be putting in. I think that's stuff you've all learned already, I hope. And determine the procurement schedule. So procurement is when you order something, how long it takes for something to get to you, right? So in this case, if you order a piece of equipment, it will not be there the next day, especially if your factory is in India, where infrastructure is not developed as well. If it's in Gambia, where infrastructure is not developed as well, or stuff like that, it can take weeks before your equipment gets there. So you need to take that type of time into consideration when you're planning, because then maybe half your production line will be there, but half is still being produced in Germany and China, then you don't have the production line, right? So you need to take time into account when you're scheduling these types of things.
Can it also be with knowledge? Or
Yeah.
is it strange?
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes you do need some certain knowledge,
Right.
and it can be a few weeks before someone can give you